Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name's Samuel Boon. I'm the manager of Signet Breeding Services, and I'm going to be talking to you about buying a Signet recorded Charollais ram. The breed has made tremendous progress in the 40 years that it's been in this country through selective breeding and measuring information about growth rate and carcass attributes. But in the last 12 months, we've made some of the biggest changes to our analyses over that time period since the early performance recording back in 1990. So I'm going to talk to you about progress in the breed, a little bit on interpretation, because this is really aimed at people that are heading off to the ram sales at the Premier Sale, Bilth and Kelso over the coming year. And I'm going to talk to you about changes to the Signet analysis, why these things are important, and then how to get more information. This is a slide that we produced to show the distribution of lambs a couple of years ago in 2017 compared to 1997. And what you can see is that we've made a real change right across the population. In fact, those top 10% animals that we were so excited about in the very early days of sire referencing, well, they'd be equivalent to the bottom 10% of the breed now. So the future rams we're going to collect semen off back in the early 90s, well, they'd be the first sheep to go out the door today. That's an incredible change within a population of any animal and any species. So it's full credit to the breeders that have been behind this recording service. Just a bit of an update in terms of what Charollais breeders do as part of Signet performance recording. At lambing time, obviously they record mum and dad, but we also collect measures of birth weight and lambing ease so that we can track the ease with which lambs are born, and also the number of lambs born so that we have an indicator of prolificacy. Lambs are weighed at 8 weeks of age, and that tells us about the genes for their growth that they get from mum and from dad. And separately, it also tells us about mum's milking ability. So we have an EBV for maternal ability, and that tells us about how well these breeding lines milk. At scanning time, which has traditionally been around sort of 20 weeks of age, but is now starting to come a little bit earlier, we will go in, weigh the lambs again, and measure muscle depth and fat depth using ultrasound. And we do that in nearly all of the Charollais flocks as a very quick and simple way of assessing their carcass attributes. We also use CT scanning to measure a lot of traits in a lot more depth among some of the elite lines, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that includes traits now such as spine length and vertebrae number and muscle area. We take all the data from Charollais breeders. We've got the pedigree, we've got massive pedigrees that go back right from back to the 70s when the breed came into the country. And so we know about all the relationships between these animals so that we don't just assess an animal on its own performance, but we take into account all its relatives, and we link to that performance data like live weight, like muscle depth. Now, there's a lot of variation between all of these measurements, and what we try and do is take into account all the non-genetic sources of information. So the age of the animal, the sex, flock feeding effects have a massive impact, and we take those into account, and dam age, fostering, rear type, etc. So we then tease out all the non-genetic influences, and what we're left with is an indicator of the genetic variation, and it's that we use to produce estimated breeding values. And from the estimating breeding values, we also produce indexes and accuracy values, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But it's the EBVs for individual traits that will be of immediate interest. So let's have a look at the traits that we produce. Here's a set of EBVs for an animal. The 8-week weight EBV is an indicator of early growth rate. So this animal has the breeding potential to be nearly 2.8 kilos heavier than a ram with an EBV of 0. It's got a slight negative on the litter size, so slightly less prolific than an average animal back in 2010, and a very slight positive on maternal ability. Again, that wouldn't be a ram with extreme genetics for milking ability in terms of females. But it has a scan weight EBV of +7, so it's got the genetic potential to be an extra 7 kilos heavier, and with nearly 3 mil more muscle across the loin at a fixed weight. And also a slight positive in terms of fat. again at a fixed weight. So it's got an overall terminal sire index, so that's taking into account all the growth and all the carcass attributes, and then it also has a maternal index. So if I was using it to breed female replacements, or particularly in our, our Dorset breeding programs where we're heavily involved in selecting female replacements going out into commercial flocks, then that becomes important as well. Now those EBVs are fine in their own right. Doesn't actually tell you how much we know about the animal. So the other thing that we'll have will be accuracy values between 0, where we know nothing, and 100, where we claim to know everything about the animal. Realistically, you often see animals in the high 90s if they're stock rams, and this is a stock ram that I'm looking at. I can see that he doesn't have that many daughters that have come through yet, so the litter size accuracy is a bit lower, but for the other traits, fairly high. We think the EBV is a good prediction of that animal's actual genetic merit. Typically, younger animals will have accuracies in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, depending on whether they've been ultrasound scanned and CT scanned. And that would be typical for young rams that don't have any progeny themselves. That's the sort of data that you would see. Now, it's all well and good to have this set of numbers, but it didn't really tell me where the animal sits in the breed. So much easier to look against a chart. So you can see this is actually a known Charollais ram, which was evaluated. This was the end of April analysis. And then I can very quickly see at a glance that he excels in terms of his early growth rate, growth through to scanning time, and also really good muscling relative to that scan weight. And slightly on the fatter side. So, these are going to be animals that will finish well at a desired carcass weight as well. They're not ultra lean genetics. But the charts definitely make it a lot easier to interpret where an animal sits within the breed. So this line of 100 down the center of the chart, that's actually the current average for the current year's lamb crop. And we can see where they sit within the breed. You'll also see information in the catalogues that you get through. I've seen the recent ones coming through from the Charollais Sheep Society. You'll see a line of data here along the bottom, and actually that's divided into 2 areas. So this information is all raw data. It shows you that the animal has been measured at 139 days of age. He weighed 65.5 kilos, had a muscle of, let's say, 29 mil, and a fat depth measurement. So it's important to see that the animals have got these measurements in, but of course that's not just telling you about genetics, that's also telling you about the farm feeding effects. That's telling you how big all the animals were. So I have a look, if they've got massive great fat depth figures here, that probably tells you they're on quite a high plane of nutrition. If the weights are lower and they're leaner, then probably they're ticking on a bit more slowly, maybe on a more forage-based diet. The information on this side of the table, well, that's all about their the EBVs and their breeding index. So again, I can see the EBV. I can see this animal has the breeding potential to be 4.6 kilos heavier. I can see it's got an index of 220. Again, that's useful information for relative rankings, but you still need to get hold of the breed benchmark. So then I can actually have a look at each of these traits and see where the animal sits in the top 50%, 25%, or top 10% of the breed. So I can see this one here has an index of 220. He's just over the top 10% cutoff. Oh, actually, that's maternal ability, isn't it? So he's actually in the top 25% for his terminal sire index. The other thing that we do at sales to help people identify the best rams is through the Seek the Standard campaign. So that's where we have neck tags that can go round a ram's neck, and we encourage the vendors to use those so that in the flurry and excitement of a sheep going in front of the auctioneer, you can see gold plus or silver standard to tell you where these animals sit within the breed. And there's a number of good animals out there within the breed. Just because an animal might be silver overall, it may sit very high, for example, for its growth attributes, or it might sit very high for muscle. And also studies have tended to show that actually even the lower ranking recorded rams can sit very, very high compared to unrecorded stock, where we actually don't know anything about their genetic merit, because all the recorded flocks are tending to move on in terms of their progress for growth and carcass traits. So there's a lot of sheep out there to look at, and it's important to match rams to your particular production system. But there's the reminder here why we're interested in this, because trial after trial has shown a consistent benefit in terms of lamb profitability from selecting high index sires. So what are all the changes about? Well, the first change we have is that we have a monthly analysis now. So that means whenever data comes in, it's only 30 days away from being updated. And as people spread their lambing seasons over time and lamb at different points, it's great that we can get them some instant feedback. There's always a challenge in keeping information up to date, and so it does mean going back to the website and having a look at the latest EBVs for your animals if you want the most up-to-date information. But we've now got a multi-breed evaluation that we use, and actually there's several million records used within that. The other big change we've made is moving to weight-adjusted carcass traits, and I'll explain that in a moment. And we've also made changes for other traits like maternal ability, and brought in new traits like birth weight. We've got some new EBVs for CT traits that I'll talk about. With all those changes, you need new breeding indexes, and if you're going to make all those changes, well, then you might as well bring the genetic base bang up to date and set a new breed benchmark. So lots of changes, lots of things for both breeders and ram buyers to get their heads around, albeit the principles of EBV selection of choosing high-figured stock for a trait of interest remain exactly the same. So weight-adjusted traits, well, it's useful for just a moment to think about how do I actually get a high muscle depth EBV sheep on the old system. What sort of sheep is it? Well, you can get there in two ways. One is that it's just a big animal. Big animal goes in front of the scanner, he measures it, and it's got a big high muscle depth. In part, that's due to its size. The other way you can get a high muscle depth sheep would be that it's got a really high muscle depth relative to its size. It might not be one of the biggest lambs at scanning, but it's got a really good depth of muscle relative to the size of that animal. Now, we already know that the scan weight EBV tells us which the big ones are. We don't need another indicator of size. The other challenge we have is that it's all well and good being big, but lambs are killed in the UK at a constant weight. So let's say 40 kilos live weight. And really what commercial producers want to know is not the muscle that it might have on it if it was 60 or 70 or 80 kilos, but what will the lambs be like when they're killed at 40? And that's why we've moved to our traits onto a weight adjusted basis. So that's really just an overview. They might get a high muscle depth because they're big, or they might have had high muscle depth because they have a good muscle depth relative to the size. And it's this latter category that have become of much more interest to us when it comes to expressing the muscle depth EBV. So we now have a muscle depth EBV that's completely independent of size, and that's really useful for commercial producers because they won't kill animals on their birthdays. They'll do them when they're a fixed weight. So weight-adjusted traits, much greater commercial focus and a better indicator of muscling and fatness and leanness at slaughter weight. And we haven't just done that for muscle depth and fat depth, we've also done that for all the CT traits as well. So breeding values indicating the amount of lean weight, or the amount of muscle rather, or the amount of fat in the carcass are also now weight adjusted. So the CT scanning work that the Charollais breed's heavily involved with is very much looking at the yields that we get from these carcasses. And there's a nice example, there's a number of nice examples showing that it works, but I thought this is a good Charollais one from up in Yorkshire. This is Mark Exelby, who'll actually be having an open day later on in August as part of his involvement with Ram Compare. That's a project where we use a number of rams from a number of different breeds on the farm. These all go to mule ewes, and we've been having a look at the data from those coming back. On this farm, we had a stock ram that was available to us, so we knew about him. He had plenty of information, but we did know that he was fairly average when it came to muscle depth on a weight-adjusted basis. And by AI, we put through a very, very high muscle depth Charollais ram, actually slightly lower in terms of scan weight, but he excelled in terms of muscle depth. We followed the progeny all the way through to the abattoir, got the data back over the course of last year, not the easiest year for finishing lambs, And actually the difference between these two rams in terms of their carcass conformation was staggering. We actually, the high muscle depth sire had the ability to lift the number of U-grade carcasses by about 50%. And these rams are all dropping, 40, 50, 60 lambs plus, because, we're only putting them to 30 or 40 ewes each. And that was a big shift in terms of the carcass grades. We've got other data that shows a very similar story, showing the link between the new weight-adjusted muscling traits and conformation, and similar for fat depth and fat class. So nice Charollais example for you there. The CT scanning data, Charollais breeders pioneered this work and helped actually calibrate the kit in the early days, and we're already assessing the weight of muscle, the weight of fat, and also giggot muscularity. So we looked at the width of the gigots for these sheep that go through the CT scanner, and so we can select for blockiness and muscularity in the carcass. We've done that for many, many years. We've got some new traits this year. So the first one that we've got is eye muscle area. So for years we've measured depth, which is the yellow line here, and it's always hard with ultrasound to then pick up those animals with very wide muscles, particularly where that muscle drops over the bone. But we can now do that using traces of eye muscle area. Those are built in and will actually help the assessment of both those traits, again, assessed on a weight adjusted basis. We've also got differences between sheep within breeds and between breeds in terms of spine length and vertebrae number, and that's differences in both the thoracic region, so up towards the ribs, and also in the lumbar region where we have these expensive cuts through the loin. Now I know Charollais are a breed that like to talk about being, having one extra chop. It's nice we've got data to prove that, and why stop there? Maybe it'll be 2 extra chops in the future. Now that we have breeding values that can assess some of the differences between these lines. So a new trait, and it's early days, but it's additional information. The only thing that I would just highlight is that, again, it is a weight-adjusted trait. So without selecting for muscling at the same time, you might have the potential just to make the carcasses longer. Reality is we want them to be longer, but also to be blocky and well-shaped around the giggot. So in combination with the muscling traits and giggot muscularity to have a long, but equally a very well-fleshed carcass. And the final one is intramuscular fat. So the image that we have is one of density when we look at a CT image. And if we zoom into the loin, we can actually look at the density of that loin, and that's a proxy trait for intramuscular fat. And we know that there's a relationship there with other traits that are influencing meat eating quality. So it's really nice that after many years of hard work and research, and by a number of scientists such as Neil Cleland, who's based up at SIUC, we've managed to turn this into a breeding value that's available to industry. What I would say is it's quite closely correlated to overall fat levels from the work we've looked at so far. So it's nice that we can measure it and monitor it. We can expect from this data it's going to tend to be the fatter animals that will tend to have a slightly higher IMF percentage. As I said, the breeding indexes had to change. They had to change because we moved all these carcass traits onto a weight-adjusted basis, but the overall aim is still the same. We want, for a terminal size, we want sheep that will breed very fast-growing, but equally well-fleshed lambs and that finish at UK slaughter weights. And then we have a new maternal index, which is about prolific, milky females with a small restriction on ewe mature size built in, but equally with fast-growing, well-fleshed lambs. So it's obviously a much more complex breeding objective. And as I said, with all these changes, we've also rebased the EBVs. So in the past, you would have had an EBV that related all the way back to the average Charollais back in 1990. And we've brought that 20 years further forward, and we now relate it to the average Charollais back in 2010. And even so, we can see there's been a lot of progress since 2010. So the base is updated. So that means all the indexes that you'll see will all be smaller because the sheep haven't got any worse. We've just changed the base. And you'll also see that the range in EBVs is also slightly reduced. But again, the important bit is the relative ranking. But the key message is the figures have changed, so get hold of your new breed benchmark so that you know where top 50%, top 25%, and top 10% sits within a breed, so you can make your selection decisions accordingly. So how to use this information? Well, there's lots and lots of information out there. The key bit is to focus on your commercial flock breeding objectives. You need to think about whether you're going to make more money by reducing days to slaughter, increasing slaughter weight, or actually whether your focus is all about carcass quality, conformation, or maybe avoiding penalties for over-fat lambs. So think about your flock objectives, then find the EBVs that will actually help you to improve your flock. Get hold of a breed benchmark, and there'll be one in the front of your sales catalogue, and there are plenty on the web or can be sent out from Signet. And then think about the sources of information. So there'll be charts and EBVs within the catalogues. There's also a phenomenal amount of information, pardon me, on the internet, and we'll talk about that in one moment. The final bit is obviously ensuring that rams are fit for purpose. So fit, fertile rams with a good health status is extremely important, particularly in this day and age. And in actual fact, online we have a blueprint for breeders that are producing rams to think about how they can produce rams that will be fit for purpose within the commercial sector. So that there's quite a bit of information out there. You can go to the AHDB website, the beef and lamb section, to obtain that information. We've moved our database this year, and we're delighted to have a new database that's available. It's going to be a lot faster than the one that we've used in the past, and with a lot more functionality. We have a sheep search, as you would have done before. What we've done there is to get it up and running, you do need to use the identical first bit of the identifier. So this is a Charollais in the Croggham flock of Jonathan and Carroll's. So we have AB, and we know for Charollais you need to put the year letter in front. So 19AB will promptly give us all of the Charollais lambs born up at Croggham, and I can press export to CSV, and I can see all their EBVs and all the information that goes with those animals. So within 2 clicks, I can see all of the flock's results. With one further click, if I click on an animal of interest, and this is a ewe lamb that I've just picked at random, if I click on that, I can go through to another web page and I can see all of the EBVs for that animal. And if I click here, I can print off a sale chart. So if I was actually taking that animal to sell it, I can print off a chart at home and make that information available. So there's lots of data that's available. In fact, this is a slightly old chart because you would also get all the new spine traits for that animal if you clicked on it today. So there's even more there than I'm showing on the screen at this moment in time. So it's very useful. The other thing that you can do is sometimes there might be non-recorded sheep of interest at a sale. Why not see if we know anything about the sire or the dam? Because you're not always buying completely blind. If we know something about mum or we know something about dad, it's worth just having a look to see if they're in the bottom or the top 10% of the breed, because their progeny aren't going to breed too far away from that mark. And funnily enough, I spend a bit of time doing that with some of my clients at the Prem, just to have a bit of a look to see where they sit. So in summary, we have EBVs, and they're a really important guide to an animal's genetic merit. It's very difficult to assess a ram's genetic merit purely visually. If you pick the biggest and best looking ram at a sale, you might have got the best genetics for growth, but history shows you've probably found the person with the biggest feed bill. And you might well find an old animal that's had really great management. It might not be the animal with the best genetic potential. We know the value of breeding improvement. We can see that in our commercial flocks, but we do need to recognize that Charollais EBVs have changed, and we need the latest information to actually help us to do that. So a new breed benchmark, but the principles that you've used for the last 20 years hold true. High figures for growth and muscling will improve lamb growth rates and overall carcass muscling and yield. So think about the things that are important to you and buy accordingly. And for more information, well, there's lots of booklets and leaflets available from AHDB and also via Signet, via the Signet website. Signet are a part of AHDB. and I sit here in the AHDB office. I shall be at the Premier Sale, so please do come and say hello. I'll be labelled up. I'm the slightly scruffy looking individual that looks slightly harassed. And there's also quite a bit of information on the old Signet website. And we're putting up lists there on how to buy a Charollais ram, the Charollais benchmarks, how the indexes have changed, why getting involved, and also on a monthly basis. And again, these will be updated. I know we have a list of the top ram lambs in the country and the top stock rams in the country. They get updated every month, so we now just make those available online. And of course, not forgetting the EBVs that are up on the Signet website. So I hope that's helped give you a flavour for what we're doing within the Charollais breed. Signet records a number of breeds, a vast number of breeds, and we have information on all of those. And we're more than happy to work with breeders and breed societies of different breeds. But we thought we'd get this up and running as we head into the ram selling season. With that, I'll say thank you very much.